industry. I think innovation, there's a lot of like creative ignorance, I would say, that is necessary for innovation. Because if you have all the marbles lining up, if you know every single thing, then it's hard to think outside of the box. But if you're going there from an approach of, okay, like, this is a problem, this isn't really working, I don't really know everything, there's some things I'm ignorant about, and that's good, right? Like when you approach like an innovative process, it's important to go there with an open mind. And I think, Microsoft was graceful enough to kind of see that in me and say, hey, like, that's something we should explore.
Hi everyone, welcome to Designdrives, where we interview the most forward-thinking designers and most innovative creators on the planet to inspire and help you to reach your full creator potential. In the episode, I chat with Teslim Alabi, lead designer at Netflix and founder of Leads by Design, who also worked at Microsoft before. During the episode, I chat with him about his background as a designer coming from Nigeria and how he used a yes mindset to gain opportunities and get ahead in his career as a designer. But also how he uses his background and passion for diversity to make organizations more customer-centric. We actually learn how you actually sell the idea of diversity internally. Secondly, we also learn about designing at Netflix and what makes the design culture special, but also what lies ahead for designers working in the entertainment space. I hope you enjoy the episode. All right, I'm here with Teslim Alabi. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. Thanks. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, really looking forward to the conversation with you. So you're a lead designer at Netflix, and then you're also the founder of Leads by Design. And when it comes to both of these roles, we're going to learn a little bit more in the next 1 hour what this is going to be about. You also have a lot of experience working in different organizations, tech organizations. What we're going to do in the episode, we're going to look into the future of the entertainment space, the role of design within the entertainment space. And we're also going to focus on diversity and inclusion, a topic that you are very passionate about and have a lot of experience in, and what it means for the design industry. So really looking forward to that. What would be really great for the audience, Teslim, if you could give them a bit more context about your journey. You have actually a quite interesting story and background, actually not growing up in the US directly, but moving there. So I think that would be really great how it started out for you as a designer, and what did you do in the last years?
Yeah. So my journey is, like you said, it's really interesting. It's non-traditional. So I grew up in Nigeria. I'm from Nigeria. I was born and raised there. And I grew up to a very, we were good. We weren't all that there. We did have enough. My parents had enough to send us to school, so that was great. But I think the great thing about my childhood was my parents just being really open to me exploring like different creative fields and really encouraging that passion when I was young. So, for example, I was able to, paint. I was able to write creative poetry. I was able to do music. And all these things, like if you think about like the African context, or just like, Nigerian homes in general, like there's this trope about Nigerian parents, encouraging like forcing their children to do, like, if it's not medicine, it has to be engineering or some other kind of like, field with prestige. But my parents were very chill. They really encouraged me to go after the things that, brought me joy. And all through my childhood, I kind of did that. So fast forward, when it was time to go to university, I went to university in Nigeria for my bachelor's, and my parents, were open to anything I wanted to do. At the time, I wanted to do medicine, which is interesting. I still kind of fell back into that trope of wanting to do something with prestige. But then I realized I didn't want to spend that much time in school, so I decided to do computer science instead. I had, taken interest in computers. I was doing graphics on computers at the time. I was working with clients, even though I didn't really think about it as a career option. I was just doing it, for friends, doing graphics on the computer and all of that. So I decided, hey, I'm going to do computer science. Dove into computer science, did it for 4 years, graduated, and realized I didn't want to code for the rest of my life. So I was like, okay, what would be the next step? If I'm not going to do computer science, like, what do I do next? So that's when I started to reflect on, my childhood and the things that really brought me joy. I was painting, I was drawing, I was doing all these like really creative things. And I said, okay, like the next step is going to be a combination of like my technical knowledge and, from computer science and something more creative. So I started researching on, like what combines computer science and creative arts. And, I started to look for courses or master's programs that did that. And I found one, digital media. This was in Drexel University in the US. And, digital media was essentially game design, animation, graphic design. They essentially expose you to the whole slate of creative arts and technology. And that was really awesome because that was actually the first time I got to experience the design process, or the traditional design process, of discover, build, test, iterate, and research, right? So that was really interesting because, I've been doing all these creative things, but there wasn't really a lot of process. Like design or creativity was art to me, was like serendipitous. And I didn't really know that people actually had process around it. So that was interesting. So I went to, left Nigeria, came to the US for my master's, and, was doing digital media. I was enjoying game design at the time. I thought I wanted to do games. And then, as an international student, you come to the US, you have, a ticking clock. If you want to stay, you have to find a job, you have to get experience. So I, towards the last year of my master's, I started to look for jobs on campus. And that's when someone referred me to a job to come design a website. So I was like, sure, I've designed websites in the past. I could probably just use Squarespace or something. And then I got to the interview and it was, oh no, we actually want to design a full app, mobile and web. And this is like, it's supposed to collect data, analyze like huge sets of data, do all these really complex things. And I wasn't really familiar with that, but I knew I didn't really have a choice, right? Like, it's like, I probably knew that was probably going to be the only job I was going to get, because I didn't really have like a lot of professional experience at the time.
Yeah.
So they were like, yeah, can you do the job? And I said, yes, I can do the job. And then I took the job and then went back and started searching, like, how do you actually build an app? How do you build software? How do you design, tools and all of that? And that's when I found out, oh, like, there's actually UI UX design. There are actually people that focus on the experience. There are people that design and build the software. There are people that manage that process, the product managers. And that really opened me up. And, you might say, hey, like, you studied computer science. How didn't you know this? Well, you could potentially go through school and school doesn't necessarily go through you. So let's just leave it at that. So that's how it was for me. But that was a huge revolution to me at the time, where I got to learn about like, UI, UX and a lot of the skills, because I had done a lot of creative exploration, graphic design, all these really creative things. It was a very, very easy transition for me. So I kind of, for that app, I took the job, focused on building that, focused on the UI, UX part of it, hired a software engineer. We built that. To cut the long story short, I built that app while working on, kind of improving my knowledge around product design and UI UX. I hired a developer, and then built out my portfolio through that app, added a couple more projects. I started interviewing. Luckily, I was able to find ways to get my portfolio in front of people at Microsoft and Google. The interesting thing is that like my last week of my graduation week, I actually flew out to Redmond and Silicon Valley for like a Microsoft and Google interview, and then flew back for my graduation. So it was just really crazy, like, and really quick how I went from not really knowing what I wanted to do with my life to interviewing with two of the companies I really wanted to work for, and then ending up at Microsoft for 5 years. Yep. So that's been a short version of my journey, but if you want to dive into any of that, happy to.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I think after that, there are a couple of things that happened. I think you found a way to create a voice for people that are underrepresented in the design industry. I think which we could look into a little bit, and as well as I think your now recent role after Microsoft moving to Netflix. I think what is really powerful also about your story, just to pick one of the things, is that you when you got that opportunity of this role that you were interviewing for, there were probably 100 reasons you could say no, right?
Yes.
And they were probably dominating, yeah. But you found a way to say yes, right? And just making it work, and just sort of like lean forward, just saying, yeah, I'm just gonna do it. I'm gonna try it out. I'm just gonna pick it up. And I think that's so powerful, because I think very often, people find so easy when they're fearing something, they find so many reasons why why not, right? And why it's not perfect, and why we shouldn't do it. And I think you had that opposite approach where you were just leaning forward and basically say, yeah, you find reasons for yes, and just gonna go ahead and do it. So that's powerful.
Yeah. 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 Thank you.
So what did you do at Microsoft, and what were your learnings then during your time working at Microsoft after your graduation?
Yeah. Yeah. So at Microsoft, I was hired to, my first project was time. So I was working on the Outlook team. So Outlook, the mail and calendar app,
Mhm.
I was focused mostly on the time management side, so the calendar side of the
Mhm.
equation. And at Outlook, my first project was to work on a time management app for students. Because I think
Mhm.
the problem at the time with Microsoft, or the some of the challenges we are facing at the time was, how do we attract a newer generation of users? Because if you think about the Microsoft ecosystem, it's a lot of
Mhm.
corporate users, it's a lot of corporations, really older people that had used some of our tools for years and even decades. So the challenge was, okay, how do we appeal to millennials and Gen Z and people that are just entering into the workforce? Because I think there was some learnings around like, hey, like if we continue to lean into our current demographic, they're eventually going to retire and leave the workforce and potentially have no need for our tools. But if we're able to target, the younger generation, people that are just coming up, appeal to them while they're still in university, we could potentially leverage that relationship as they get into the workforce. So the challenge was, how do you design a time management solution for students, and not just a time management solution, but a whole life communication and time tracking and organizational tool for the younger generation of students. So it took a lot of research. We did a lot of trips to universities. We talked to a lot of students, younger people, trying to figure out like their time management habits and how different they are from, like people that might be professionals. And there were a lot of learnings there. Like at the time, Snapchat was, huge,
Mhm.
Instagram too as well. So it's like, how do we create tools that command the same level of attention, or maybe not the same level, but a similar level of attention in the minds of these people? And, for me, like coming out of school at the time, I also, it's very funny because like during my interview at Microsoft, and, looking back, it was probably a very stupid thing, but I got there and they were asking me about like my time management habits. And, I was terrible at the time with like email and calendar. I didn't really use a calendar. I didn't really have like a system of tracking like my life. I was a student, so it was just school that was in my head. And, I had like a I still have terrible mailbox habits, but, I don't have zero inbox, none of that. I don't organize my email or clean it up. When you're interviewing with the Outlook team, you probably don't want to say, hey, like, I don't care about time management or email, but I did. And, that was a risk, but I think it also kind of appealed and told them that,
Mhm.
hey, like, I'm essentially the kind of person you're looking for. There's a reason why these tools don't work for me. So maybe you want to listen to what I have to say, right? Maybe you want to learn, like, why people in my generation aren't necessarily using these tools.
Yeah, just to add, I think I think
Mhm.
it's funny that I mean, you interviewed there, sort of as a first show after your graduation, but
Yeah.
it makes total sense that they hired a student for this,
Yes.
right? If they want to,
Yes.
it doesn't make sense to hire like someone that is like very senior for this, because they wanted to
Yes.
approach these new people. And I think
Yes.
it's interesting you mentioned this convenience factor. I think that also the
Mhm.
other solution had, and I think that's the chance there is that not knowing at all is an advantage for innovation, right?
Yes.
And I think you brought this with you because
Yes.
you had just a different mindset.
Yes.
But yeah, sorry for interrupting you. Just
No
yeah.
worries. No worries. Yes. No, absolutely. I think innovation, there's a lot of like creative ignorance, I would say, that is necessary for innovation. Because
Yeah.
if you have all the marbles lined up, if you know every single thing, then it's hard to think outside of the box. But if you're going there from an approach of, okay, like, this is a problem, this isn't really working, I don't really know everything, there's some things I'm ignorant about, and that's good, right? Like when you approach like an innovative process, it's important to go there with an open mind. And I think, Microsoft was graceful enough to kind of see that in me and say, hey, like, that's something we should explore. So, I went in there, we worked on the app. It was a really fun project, really, really great because, we could take a lot of creative liberty to create this really fun, engaging, nice looking piece of software. And, eventually the plan was to launch that app globally, but, there were some changes in the company and we decided to pivot. But what happened was we took a lot of the learnings that we had from that app. We took some high level ones where like, people love to combine their tasks and their calendar. Like they think about, tasks, to-do lists, and, time management, like actual calendar blocks in the same manner, right? So like imagine creating a single view for those, or creating a system where like, people could switch between both, or, drag a task to a calendar, all of that. So we took a lot of the interesting learnings from that project and then brought it into the core Outlook project. And I think, even though we didn't launch, we didn't have like a global launch, a lot of the newer features you're seeing in Outlook was based on some of the work we did years ago. So that was a fun project. And then I transitioned from that one to working on the core Outlook time management team. And I worked on a lot of, big projects there. The thing about Outlook is there's a lot of scale. So like if you think about the amount of users on Outlook, on the Windows platform and on Outlook, it's a lot of people. So when you're designing for Outlook, you're having to think about like several different kinds of users. So typically we have our professional users, people that use Outlook in the context of work. And then we have people that might use Outlook, outside of work, same way you might use Gmail. So like when you're designing features, I think the old Microsoft would focus on, the people that are obviously paying, the people that are, professionals using it in the context of work. And then we end up creating these really complex systems, right? And then someone that's coming from Gmail is like, what the hell is this? This is a lot. This is very complex. But like we're optimizing for the people that, have a lot of experience using the tools. But I think there's a shift, and very positive shift in Microsoft's thinking, which is we want to design systems that can appeal to both sides. Simple enough. Simplicity was a very huge factor while I was there. So like we want to design systems that are simple, but can also adapt and scale to any kind of user. So we don't have to have like several different kinds of experiences. We can create a unified experience and then have that adapt to different kinds of users. So that I worked on, things like the meeting forum, where you go to create your meetings, redesign that, saw a lot of positive impact on the product because of that. And then, worked on several different time management solutions. And then the last thing I worked on at Microsoft was Spaces, a project that I co-founded. And that was an innovation project, 0 to 1. And it was very interesting, probably one of the best experiences of my life. It was challenging and it was trying, but I learned a lot from that experience. And what we're trying to do essentially was we're trying to rethink productivity. Like, how do you rethink how people manage their lives, essentially from a high level? And this was a project that we started out because of, based on user feedback. We were in Paris for something called Compass Connect, which is this big roadshow essentially that, we go to yearly to go demo new features, talk to our customers, connect with our corporate customers. And while we're there, we're just, we're trying to show them new stuff. And the users were like, this is a lot. Like, it's great that you're working on new things, but like, what about all the old things I still have to manage? Like, I still have to go to all these different places to figure out like where all my stuff is, because the Microsoft ecosystem is so huge. So the problem was like, okay, you have so many different apps, you have so many different views, so many different paths to how you could potentially organize yourself. How do we create like a view that potentially accumulates all of that data, gives you like a single place to go? And that was a challenge, right? But also we saw a lot of value in potentially thinking about that idea. So that's what we did. It was very interesting, like how the project kicked off, how we're able to get funding, pitching to, essentially it was like pitching to investors, but like we were able to get internal funding and backing for the project. And that was a really, really great, experience for me.
How did you pitch it internally? How did you make people excited about the product? Did you came in with the insight that you were gathering at the conference, where you're saying like, hey guys, like there's a thing I learned, or we learned, we should do something about it, created like a visual teaser, or like what was your approach towards bringing people in an organization behind you or behind the team that you had? How did you approach that?
Yeah. So First, it wasn't like a one-man solo job. Like I had a very, very strategic PM leader. She was fantastic, has a lot of experience, and also like a group of people that already were involved in kind of the ideation and really believed in the idea. So that made my life easier in terms of like, aligning. There wasn't like a lot of internal alignment within the team that was actually building it. So we're all aligned. So that was the first thing. But I think like just to paint the picture a bit better, just in terms of like how Microsoft functioned at the time. Microsoft is a great organization, very well, oiled and positioned to lead initiatives. But as with every big organization, there is some hesitation around like innovation, especially around like places where you might not be familiar with, right? So there's a lot of like, this is our bread and butter. Let us work on improving this thing as opposed to think about stuff a different way. So there was a lot of like internal hesitation, I would say, around like, a project like this. But I think one thing that, was great at Microsoft was, every quarter we would have these fix, hack, learn weeks. So they call it fix, hack, learn because you could either decide to fix something within the project, hack a new thing, so build something brand new, or take out the time to learn. So it was a full week of just, you have 1 week, go figure out what you want to do. So, some people would build out teams, bring people together, work on like projects, and then you would have a prize, or like, they would vote on like, the best project. So that was a really fun thing. But those kinds of, innovative allowances really gave us the time to think about a project like this. So it was in one of those fix, hack, learn weeks that we actually took out the time from work and said, hey, let's tackle this small problem. So we kind of built out, we did like a sprint for a week, thought about the problem that we heard in Paris, and brought in people like experts, people that had, thought about this space in the past. And then we built out, at the end, we had a prototype. And it was with that very visual prototype. And we also created like a story around it. Like, what is the story behind this? So there was a lot of storytelling elements around like, okay, what is the function of this product? Or what are we trying to get out of this? So with that prototype and the story, we essentially just started to socialize it. So essentially we went to, a big forum where, employees, it's kind of like a big Outlook meeting. We kind of showed, this is what we came up with. It wasn't a very, very forceful pitch. It wasn't like, hey, we this is super important. This is high priority. Obviously, you're trying to balance this against all the other priorities in the company. But we created a story that I feel it was compelling enough to get people on board. So, everyone we showed, because of just the amount of effort and the time we took, people we showed were like, this is something I really want to have. I wish I had this, right? And I think you want to get people to that point with the stories that you tell. I need to have this. And I think slowly but surely, obviously people started to get in line and say, hey, like, this is something that we should explore at least. We should at least give some time to explore. So it was a lot of like going to meetings, presenting, getting questions, also a lot of hard work in terms of the story that we wanted to tell too as well.
I think it's a powerful story. I think, and it's actually a topic that came up multiple times in the podcast. One of my favorite themes, the area of incubation and how designers can be helping there. And I think your story outlines that really well. There was one other episode I want to point out here, episode 25 with Shiva Jaini. He was working at Google for a very long time. He incubated together with a team the idea of YouTube Kids, which is then also went into production. It's now a major piece of YouTube, because they saw from interviewing parents that the way YouTube was consumed by kids is not perfect for kids, right? And I think, so basically they did a story, they did a video prototype and just told the story, and they got funding, similar to your story. I think one of the powers of designers is to tell a story, is to visualize the abstract, is to visualize the theory, and emotionalize it for people, and making it like this one factor that you were pointing out, that making it emotional for people, and it feels real even though it's not real. And then that creates a set of a place for a discussion, and this vision that doesn't has to be exactly what it's going to turn out in the end, but at least it takes it from a posted and a theoretical discussion into an image that people can use as a baseline for discussion. Then you can use this image to say like, I see it a little bit different, right? You can use it as a canvas for feedback. And I think that's so powerful about, I think, your story and many others where, designers are involved in incubating these new ideas. And this is just also just something I would like to share with the audience, that, if you in an organization, you can be involved in these hackathons or in incubating new ideas. I think if designers position themselves well in these projects, they can be a force of help and support. So yeah,
Absolutely.
thanks for sharing that.
Yep.
Just to add one more thought, I recently read the book, The Thousand Brains. I don't know if you know that book, sort of like how the mind is structured, how the brain works, right? And how computers are working is very different, right? And I think sort of like, I think you're pointing out the topic that, files are structured everywhere. I think one of the key challenges is that I think computers work very different to how the brain works.
Yes.
Yeah. So like the brain works with reference frames and actually has, things located at multiple places. For example, the name of your dog is, for example, located at multiple locations in your brain. Whereas, computer, you always have like one way where you kind of store it. And so that's a big problem. Like, how can you make that more aligned? And I think that's where people talk about true AI. Where actually they're trying to figure out basically how you can basically have AIs be less specialized on certain things and be sort of like focused on sort of machine learning and sort of like doing a certain task, but actually works more similar to the brain, where it could potentially help you. And I think that's just maybe an outline about like how a topic like Microsoft Space could even evolve into the future. But I think it was already super interesting. So basically, you had some great years at Microsoft. Then I think already during that time, I think you got very passionate about highlighting people that are unrepresented in the design community and mentor them. And actually, I think recently you found actually a formal organization for that. But maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that journey was quite interesting, like how I started to mentor people. Obviously, I have a very different background from what you typically see in the tech space. Being a Black person, being African, those came with its own challenges. And when I look back at people at home are often looking for people that look like them, that they can relate to, right? Like they want to people. There are a lot of role models everywhere, but like a person is more likely to relate to someone that looks like them, that has very similar experiences. So for me, like mentorship was a journey for me because I would often assume that, hey, like whatever I want to share, like I'm pretty sure there's someone out there already sharing it. So what's the point of sharing? Like I'm also a bit, introverted, and I like to keep to myself. So I was like, what if people judge me? What if, I don't know what I'm saying? And what if, just the imposter syndrome of being in these spaces. So I for a while I hesitated on actually making any moves around like publicly mentoring people, but people would reach out to me every once in a while, and I would respond to them and kind of help point them in the right direction. And after a couple of years of doing that, like I started to see a lot of positive impact. Like a person would message me out of nowhere and say, hey, like 4 years ago you responded to my message, my LinkedIn message or my Twitter message, and right now I'm at Google. And I couldn't have done that because of you. Or someone would say, years ago, I listened to you speak X somewhere, and you mentioned this, and this is how I applied it, and this is where I am. And I started to realize that like some of the things that I take for granted are actually having impact on people's lives. And I thought about, okay, like what if I could scale this up? What if I could maybe take this from a place of it being like a one-on-one thing to maybe trying to reach more people, trying to maybe potentially get more funding in the future to give these people more opportunities to as well and connect them to employers. What if we could do more with this? So that's where the idea for Leads by Design came from. But before then, I had been mentoring people in some capacity since almost 2017. But Leads by Design was a formalization of that. It was a step for me to actually say, hey, like, I feel like maybe this could have more impact if I formalized it and if I decided to get more help, because, that's also something that I struggle with, is kind of asking for help. Like I've always done things by myself. The year before I did Leads by Design, I put out like a tweet and I said, I'm going to offer mentorship for free. And I had almost 500 people apply to be mentored, and I had these one-on-one sessions with at least 100 people, and a lot of those people eventually ended up getting jobs, relocating out of Nigeria, moving to new jobs, getting promoted. And that was really what spurred me into action and saying, hey, like, what if we actually formalize this? What if I could scale this up? And that's when I said, okay, I need to organize it a bit better. I need to get help. Obviously, I'm juggling a lot of things, so it doesn't make sense to just try to do this by myself. And the idea and the mission behind Leads by Design is essentially I want to help to diversify the face of design. Design is already a very empathetic discipline. And I know that there's a lot of potential and a lot of growth opportunities within the design space. But often, like I go into spaces and I'm the only person that looks like me there. I'm the only person that people can try to relate to, like people that look like me. So what I'm trying to do is to get more people like me into design, to show them what's possible, right? To show them that, hey, like you could come into this space and you could thrive, and that's what I'm really trying to do. It's all about like representation. And it's about showing people like, hey, like there's a possible path in design. And also, I think there's also an element of, I didn't go to top Ivy League school. I didn't have a traditional design education, right? Like I did have some adjacent education around design, but like it wasn't a direct, hey, like, good school for HCI or product design. But I was still able to make something out of it. So it's showing people that, hey, like if you're able to take certain risks, the risk we talked about, like, saying yes, those are some of the things that you could do. Saying yes, putting yourself, in front of, other people that could potentially appreciate your work, finding ways to elevate your work and to tell your story. Very, very simple things that a lot of people take for granted. Like you could make a tremendous change in your career. So that's what I'm trying to do with Leads by Design.
Oh yeah, I think that's a powerful story, and
Mhm.
I think it's so great that you started this.
Mhm.
If you would think about diversity and inclusion in design, I
Mhm.
think you already mentioned there's tremendous opportunity, and I totally agree to that. If you would
Mhm.
think about these organizations or the design industry in general, what do you
Mhm.
think are the biggest roadblockers? What do you think are the
Mhm.
biggest challenges in terms of moving this forward
Mhm.
substantially? And what would be your advice? So that that's the second
Mhm.
part of the question. What would be your advice for designers that are maybe not the people that you directly trying to help, but maybe the people that are in the environment and could
Mhm.
also make a positive contribution helping
Mhm.
that in that transformation?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, like what I see in the industry, and, my perspective has changed over time. But I think like when I first got into the industry, I was ignorant about a lot of things. So for me, I was in this new space and I wasn't really thinking about like diversity or like the fact that I might be like the only person in the room, or like, what that means in terms of like how much leverage and how much,
Mm.
how much my opinions can be taken into account. So I was just doing things. My mindset was, hey, like I'm here to be the best I can possibly be. I'm here to work. I don't really want to think about a lot of those things. But I think my perspective started to change and shift. I think aligned to kind of how the environment in the U.S. kind of uh, evolved. If you think about like some of the protests and some of the unfortunate events in the U.S. that has led to a lot of discussion around politics and just like diversity and inclusion. Those were also having an impactful, moments on me too as well. I was also impacted by a lot of those movements and a lot of those things. And even at work too, it spurred a lot of conversation, right? Like it spurred a lot of conversation around like, why these things were happening in society and how companies like Microsoft and Netflix could help to change those narratives. And during some of those conversations, I would hear some of my leaders at the time say, the reason why we don't have enough diverse talent is because the pipeline is broken. I don't know if you've heard that phrase, but it's one that's often cited where we don't really have, there are not enough Black designers, right? Like there are not enough people that are going to school for design that are Black or that are Asian or that are, a certain demographic. And that's why it's not really translating in how many people we hire. So that is often, some of the reasons you might hear that a place isn't diverse enough. But like, I think that is something that we're starting to find out isn't necessarily right because, there are a lot of designers, but like the way that we recruit the way that we appeal to those designers. Some of them might not be comfortable applying to bigger companies because they feel like they might be rejected. So you never get them actually in the pipeline. It's not that the pipeline is broken. It's that like you're not even getting them in the pipeline, or maybe some of them are getting in, but like we have ways that aren't necessarily supporting them to get through that pipeline. They don't really have the support to get through. So there's a lot of systemic problems with just how we hire and recruit and appeal to these communities that I think that we can change and evolve, so like in terms of like outreach, like, maybe instead of expecting these people to even know like about design and what the opportunities are, can we as companies invest more in education, right? Like, can we invest more in outreach? Can we go to these campuses to tell these people about what's possible? Right. Like, there, like for me, like I really didn't have any clue that, design was actually something that you could do as a career. Right. Like, and I'm sure there are a lot of people like me. And that's why I spend a lot of time in Twitter spaces, in IG lives, just sharing like, hey, there's a potential journey here. Like you could actually do this as a career. So I feel like there's a lot of work to do around outreach. There's a lot of work to do around education. And the companies that, if you're complaining about the pipeline, it's not the people, the underrepresented people's responsibility to fix that pipeline. It is the companies that are going to benefit billions, potentially from fixing that pipeline that should be taking the charge on that, right? Like if you have a more diverse product or a more diverse product team, you're going to have a product that works better for a greater population, right? Like it's a competitive advantage for you to have a product team that is diverse, for you to have a product that is built by people that come from diverse backgrounds, right? So it's not a bad thing, right? So we should look at it as just any other investment, right? Like we're paying this forward so that we can reap the benefits later. It's an economic decision as much as it is a social justice decision, right? Like there's a win-win for these companies too as well. So I feel like, the problems that I see is, obviously the citation that the pipeline is broken. I don't think the pipeline is broken. I think we just have to be a bit more deliberate and intentional about how we recruit people into that pipeline, and also giving them the support to get through that pipeline and to actually get to an offer. And then also, like there's a lot of work that we need to do in terms of trust, building trust, right? Because there's a lot of hesitation around, it's one thing to get someone into tech. It's another thing to keep them there, right? So a person might get into tech, and because of all the negative experiences they would face, they just kind of give up and say, hey, like I'm going to try something else, right? So it's one thing to get them in through the pipeline, but how do we actually foster a culture that makes sure that these people thrive, right? It's through training, it's through support, it's through having these tough conversations, it's through allyship, right? There are a lot of things that we could do internally to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I have to say, I think you're pointing out a couple of very important topics. I think to just point out one thing that I really like is that you were saying it is as much a social justice topic as it is a business investment.
Yes.
And I think this is clever to say, because just to give you a similarity, sustainability, how do you get people to invest in sustainability? Is usually not saying that you invest in sustainability, but you invest into things that are coming, and sustainability comes as a byproduct to it. Yes. And this is how you get attention. It's actually the same way how you sell design. You don't sell design by saying it looks more pretty. You're selling design, but what the audience wants to hear and what they are kind of like listening to. So you would say, well, this design improves our product KPIs, whatever these product KPIs. And for example, we could generate more. We can have people staying long in our application by creating more utility value to it, etc. Right? So you're trying to frame your ask around into trying to find it with the match of what the person that you're trying to convince about cares most, right? I mean, that's sort of like sales 101, right? Yes, and I think so you did something very clever where you were saying, that's sort of like how you also basically want people to look into that. So basically it's a strategic decision to hire a more diverse set of people, because you're gonna have a better match between your internal team and your customers. Yeah. Yes. So that's number one. You want that there's a strong match there. This is kind of an obvious business advantage, like a competitive advantage, like you say. And the other thing is that you may come up with more innovative ideas because you have a more diverse group of people. That's the nature of innovation, comes from friction and different points of views and different backgrounds, right?
Exactly.
So really, really like that. I was listening to a talk recently from an architect who is trying to make buildings more sustainable. But he's not talking about sustainability when he talks to his clients. When he talks about making the building more durable, of more lighter materials, like all of these different things, and it's by that fostering sustainability. And I think taking that same approach, instead of like trying to hammer it in with these maybe more soft arguments, but just like looking at what your audience is trying to convince, or what the organization tries, what are they listening to, and using these open ears and topics basically as a gateway.
Yes, exactly. That's spot on.
I think that's so amazing that you push this forward. Talking a little bit about Netflix. So you have been at Netflix now for some time, and I think the entertainment space, I think, is interesting. Also from a technology stand and a customer behavior standpoint, there's the question is like, what is entertainment, first of all? And there are so many different types of entertainment, and I think we have been going away from the radio and the television to a wide range of different solutions where people consume vertical video content, some consume like for a short amount of time. It became very snackable, long periods of time with more horizontal content. And it's happening more on the go. It's became much more integrated in our life. But I would be super interested about what have you learned at Netflix so far when it comes to how design can foster innovation in the entertainment industry, if I would frame it as large as that, and what is the role of design within that?
Yeah, so Netflix has definitely been an eye-opening like time for me, mostly because I think it's a very, very different culture. So I think the company itself is so different and so unique, that it's like you're in a very, very different space. At least moving from Microsoft to Netflix was, a very huge shift for me. And I think it was also kind of what I was looking for, because I had worked on this, a couple of growth-minded or innovation projects at Microsoft, and I was like, okay, this is kind of the kind of work I want to keep doing. So moving into Netflix kind of gave me the freedom to kind of seek out those kinds of work internally. But I think like to your question, the role of design is essentially, I think, the role of design anywhere. The design essentially creates a compelling story that is inspiring, and I think that can rally people around an idea. But I think design also at Netflix is powerful because, one thing that Netflix has always had, which was a conscious investment, was, an emphasis on technology, right? Like, so Netflix is an entertainment company, but with a huge emphasis on technology, right? Like if you look at the history of Netflix, it has been the amount of investment they've made in technology and just making sure that they are, trendsetters. They're ahead of the game in terms of like, what is the best way to stream? What is the best way to make sure that we have like, very lossless transmission? What is the best way to, engage people, to try out things quickly, A/B testing, all of that, like all of those investments, have kind of paid off in terms of, just how much market like Netflix has been able to capture and dominate over the past couple of years. So like design's role in that is essentially like, creating, I think, the story behind it, right? Like, why are we going after these things? Why is it important to the customer? But also to make sure that we are creating a best in class experience, an experience that is essentially, leading in terms of, competitors. So I think like, design's role is very important at Netflix, right? Like there's a huge emphasis on design. But also I think like the thing I found at Netflix is that there's also a lot of power that is given to design too as well. Designers at Netflix have a lot of, just because of the culture and the way it's been set up, we have a lot of, I would say, power to drive the outcomes of the product, right? There's a lot of power given to us. There's a lot of freedom given to us to really take liberty and say, hey, like, if you see a problem, you have the ability to look at that problem, gather insights, and go after the problem and try to solve it. And I think this is what I've seen across the board at Netflix, not just in design. So people are empowered to really, really take responsibility and have the freedom to go against like goals that ladder up to the broader organizational objectives. There isn't like a special role for design, but I would say like design definitely has a voice at Netflix. And I'm sure you could tell from, the way that the experience has evolved over the years. It has a voice. I think at Microsoft and some other bigger companies, there was a time when like, design kind of had to prove value and kind of, solicit to be at the table and then, kind of have to wait to be invited. But I think, at least from what I can tell from looking at the history of Netflix, I've only been there for, a year plus. But I think there has always been an understanding in, we need to invest in technology, and technology is what's going to give us the edge. So I think, that's one of the strong points of Netflix right now.
Yeah, I think totally agree. And I think you could always see it also from the digital experience. I think that was very early on. I think always something that stood out to Netflix. Looking at Netflix, I think that we also, before the episode recording, we talked about this shortly. There's a certain aspect about the Netflix culture which is maybe different to how other organizations work. And it really emphasizes the freedom of making our decisions. But maybe you can just elaborate a little bit on that.
Yes. Yeah. So, Netflix has like an infamous culture memo that details, kind of how the company functions internally. And, when I was about to join Netflix, I did a lot of research on this culture memo, and I was terrified and excited at the same time, because I was terrified because, I've never really been in a space where like you have so much freedom, but also like in a space where like you're solely responsible for the actions you take. Like it's kind of like a balance of like, oh, you have the freedom, you can make decisions, you can move quick. To an extent, you have power as an IC. If you're an IC, you actually have a lot of, there's a lot of freedom given to you to drive initiatives, to, come up with things. And I think one huge part of the culture is also trust too as well. The company tries to hire the best people and puts a lot of trust in them, right? Like there's a lot of like, hey, like we trust you to make the best decisions that are going to be in the interest of the company. And that's something that, is missing from a lot of organizations, right? Like you get into a company and, the way they treat you is like, there's always kind of it's not a full transparent relationship, right? Like there's kind of like always a hint of suspicion from both sides, right? Like you're not really sure what the company's thinking, and the company is kind of apprehensive of all your moves. So like there's a lot of like friction that can potentially create. But at Netflix, it's like, Netflix has a very powerful culture where, feedback is solicited. Like people can walk up to you and give you feedback directly, right? Like, and tell you, hey, like you're doing this great, but like maybe you should consider this. There's a lot of openness. There's a lot of transparency. And also just like, just the freedom, right? Like I talked about expenses being one of the things that's highlighted in the memo. Where like, to a certain extent, to a certain spend amount at Netflix, you don't really have to get like approval, right? Like they depend on you to make the best decisions in the interest of Netflix. You could potentially get audited, and if you're doing something wrong, that would come to light. But like in most cases, it's like we trust you to make the best decision. We trust that you're going to, only spend money on the things that bring value to Netflix. So to a certain amount, you actually don't have to get approval. You don't have to go ask your manager, can I invest in this course? Or can I buy this book? Or can I buy this thing that's going to help me in this design sprint? You can go ahead and do it, right? Like it's kind of, your manager is just going to tell you, well, think about our culture, freedom and responsibility. Decide if it's something that you need. And if it is, then go ahead, right? As long as you can justify it. So that's a very, very different culture from what I was used to in the past. And I think it's very, very different and unique in terms of just tech companies too as well. So there are also certain aspects of the culture, feedback, like I mentioned too as well, is one that is really, really celebrated, and people are very eager to hear, because we believe that feedback is the bedrock of like improvement. Freedom and responsibility, I talked about that, but like I think the biggest thing is just like that I experienced was like there's a lot of trust that is placed in employees, and that is something that can really be empowering, right? Like imagine if you're going into a room knowing that like your manager has your back, knowing that like you have the trust of the company behind you, right? Like that you can make decisions. And if you're wrong, like it's not like if you make a bad move, you get tossed out, right? There is a lot of understanding, right? Like we're moving fast, we're taking big risks. Sometimes we might be right, sometimes we might be wrong. But there's a lot of understanding, and I think a lot of grace in those spaces. But I think the caveat, the thing that makes me or made me a bit hesitant or like, really scared was like, if you read the culture memo, it talks about like hiring only A players, right? Like they're trying to hire, they're not a family, but they're a sports team, right? Like in a sports team, only the top players get to play, right? Like only the people that have proven themselves, the people that have a good record, and if you're not meeting those demands, you're gonna get let go of, right? So it's also the balance of like, there's a lot of trust placed in you, but the trust is placed in you because we believe that you're very competent, and we believe that we've hired the best person for this job. So that's kind of like, it's a lot of pressure, but I do appreciate like a lot of the freedom, a lot of the trust that's placed in the employees.
Yeah, I think it's powerful, and I think, as you said, it's very different to how most organizations are structured. And it's going to be interesting if more organizations gonna, I don't know what, if there's going to be some kind of data that kind of going to show in a few years what it does for organization, and maybe more organizations going to pick it up. And that providing people with that, giving people that agency, I think is powerful. um as I said also before the recording, it puts some pressure on the HR side for sure to hire the right people to actually take that responsibility. Just as a last question, because I know we're getting a little bit over time, and as a last question, if you think about the entertainment space and how it's going to move forward, what excites you as a designer most when you think about what the space gonna allow you to do in the next years, and what kind of like new ideas kind of inspire you for design, specifically looking at maybe what designers can do in the space?
Yeah, so I feel like we are in the golden age of entertainment, and hopefully, like it keeps getting better and more optimized. And but I feel like we're in a very good time, right? Like there's a lot of choice on the market. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of really really great quality content that is being put out, and I think that and not just the quality but the volume, right? Like there are a lot of streaming options. There's a lot of ways that you can consume entertainment. And not just like with streaming, but with games and all these other forms of media. And I feel like that comes with, that volume comes with a challenge, a new challenge for design and a new challenge for technology, which is how do you, streamline all of that into content that feels personal to me, right? I think that is going to be the next challenge, which is, okay, we have a lot of these options, but I think at some point as human beings, that's going to get overwhelming, right? And I feel like, the future of entertainment is personal. It's personalized. It is tailored. I think Netflix is in a position to really, really drive a lot of innovation in this space. There is a lot of opportunity here to really dial in on, okay, like who is this person? How can I create like a feed that is personal to them? How can I suggest things that I know that they are going to be interested in? I know Netflix has done a lot of work in this space with their personalization algorithms and all the other things they've tried in the past. So I feel like the next challenge is going to be like, how do you get all of these options? How do I figure out like a way to navigate them? How do you make it easier for me to navigate all the options I'm presented with? Because the volume is definitely going to be, it's a great thing for the consumer, like you have options, but too many options is kind of how we landed on TV, right? Like you had thousands of channels and deciding what to watch was hard. And I think we're kind of gets into that point with streaming too as well. And I think the challenge for design is going to be, how do we lean into our superpowers of understanding the user, of empathizing with the user, of really getting to know who the user is, and and use that as a baseline and a basis to design experiences that really, really, really put the person at the center, right? Like, I think like we've kind of steered towards a model where the content is the center, right? Like we're focusing on the content and how we deliver the content. And I think as designers, we have to pull that conversation back and say, okay, like, how do we refocus the user, the person, the individual in this equation? And how do we create content around them as opposed to content for them?
Mm-hmm. And I think I totally agree. And what's interesting about it, it's really an area of work where technology and design really have to work together. You talked about personalization, the algorithms, right, and the technology, and all the backend innovation that needs to happen there in order to make these clever decisions. There's this meme that you maybe have seen that 50% of the time you spend on like deciding which movies to watch, and maybe 50% like you're actually watching the movie. There's sometimes like especially in a group, then it can be very difficult to make like a decision, right? And I think it has become way better than TV, like you said. What kind of properties in a movie do you analyze, and what kind of algorithmic decision do you make based out of that, and what kind of assumptions you make about a person, right? Is the technology really making recommendations that are similar to how people would structure their interests, or basically is the technology and sort of like the way you collect the data and sort of like try to make assumptions about the person actually matching with the person, right? And the interest of the person. And I think that's a design challenge and a psychology challenge. But it's also a technology challenge, so it's super interesting, and a lot of opportunities for designers to make impact on the business. And so Teslim, thank you so much for taking the time. We've been going a little bit over time here, but I appreciate the time, and I would just like to thank you on behalf of the audience for sharing all of these great insights.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right, that was the episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments about your thoughts and biggest learnings from the episode. I'm always super curious about that. You can also tag me in a post about your biggest takeaway and share your insights with others to pass on your learnings. If the episode provided you a lot of value, make sure to follow, subscribe, and share it with friends and colleagues so they also have the chance to learn and grow. Until next time, cheers.